We only use 10% of the brain. Few falsehoods have endured in popular culture as long as this one. The idea that we waste 90% of our brain capacity sounds hopeful, almost magical, as if we could unlock superpowers with the right training. But modern neuroimaging destroys this fantasy. All brain scans show that even during sleep, virtually all brain regions maintain some level of activity. The origin of this myth likely lies in misinterpretations of the work of psychologist William James in the early 20th century, who claimed that we only used a fraction of our mental potential, referring to undeveloped capabilities, not inactive brain tissue. Then, 1930s advertising distorted these words to sell self-help courses. Hollywood did the rest. Movies like Lucy turned this lie into a visual spectacle. The reality is more fascinating than fiction. The human brain, weighing barely 2% of total body weight, consumes approximately 20% of our total energy. Maintaining such a metabolically expensive organ would make no evolutionary sense if we only used 1/10 of it. Every brain region has specialized functions that are activated according to the demands of the moment. When you read these words, your visual cortex processes the letters, your Wernicke's area decodes the language, your hippocampus relates the information to previous memories, and your prefrontal cortex evaluates the relevance of what you learn. Brain lesion studies confirm that there is no spare brain tissue. Damage to even small areas can produce specific and devastating deficits, from the inability to recognize faces to the loss of the sense of time. If we truly had 90% of the brain unused, random injuries would rarely cause severe problems. But clinical neurology proves the opposite. Every millimeter counts. Even glial cells, which for decades were considered mere brain glue without important cognitive function, are now known to play crucial roles in signal transmission, regulation of cerebral blood flow, and modulation of synaptic plasticity. There is not a single cerebral component that we can classify as expendable. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself and create new connections, does not require activating dormant regions, but strengthening or weakening existing connections. When you learn a new language, you are not waking up the sleeping 90%. Rather, the neural networks related to language expand and refine through repeated use. The brain is like a muscle in this sense. It doesn't have inactive parts waiting to be discovered, but capabilities that are developed with practice. This myth also downplays the real complexity of learning and personal development. Suggesting that we could be geniuses just by activating more brain trivializes the effort, dedication, and time necessary to master any skill. Experts in any field do not use more brain than novices. They have simply optimized the relevant neural connections through years of deliberate practice. The persistence of this myth reflects a deep human desire. The hope that we are more than we appear, that there is hidden potential waiting to be unleashed. But the truth is that we are already using our entire brain, and even so, the capacity for learning, creating, and adapting that this provides us is extraordinary without needing fiction. The left hemisphere is logical and the right is creative. This simplistic dichotomy has invaded self-help books, educational programs, and even job interviews. You are asked if you are a left brain or right brain person as if you could pigeonhole human complexity into two opposing categories. Neurological reality disproves this artificial division. Almost all complex cognitive functions require the coordination of both hemispheres working simultaneously. The origin of this myth has legitimate but misinterpreted scientific roots. In the 1960s, Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for his studies on split-brain patients. People whose corpus callosum, the structure connecting both hemispheres, had been severed to treat severe epilepsy. These studies revealed that each hemisphere has certain specializations, but popularizers exaggerated these differences to create a false dichotomy. It is true that the left hemisphere usually dominates language processing in most right-handed people, while the right shows advantages in spatial processing and face recognition. However, This does not mean that logical thought resides exclusively on one side and creativity on the other. A University of Utah study examined more than 1,000 brains using functional magnetic resonance imaging while participants performed various cognitive tasks. The result was resounding. They found no evidence that people preferentially use one hemisphere over the other. Creativity, contrary to popular belief, is not a chaotic process of the right hemisphere. It requires multiple stages that involve both hemispheres: the generation of original ideas, the critical evaluation of their viability, the synthesis of disparate concepts, and the technical execution of the final product. Mathematicians, supposedly the archetypes of the left brain, often describe their discoveries as acts of creative intuition. Artists, classified as right brain, need technical planning and logical reasoning to materialize their visions. Albert Einstein, frequently cited as an example of creative thinking, attributed his discoveries to both imagination and mathematical rigor. His theory of relativity was born from visual thought experiments, traditionally associated with the right hemisphere, but required years of intense mathematical work to be formalized. Modern creativity science confirms that the most innovative people do not favor one hemisphere, but rather have highly integrated neural networks that allow fluid communication between both sides. The corpus callosum, which connects both hemispheres with approximately 200 million nerve fibers, exists precisely to ensure that they work together. During complex tasks like reading a poem, the left hemisphere processes syntax and literal meaning while the right interprets metaphor and emotional prosody. Separating these functions would be impossible without destroying the complete experience. This myth has also caused real educational harm. Some school systems have spent resources on programs that supposedly balance the hemispheres or activate the less used side, based on pseudoscience. Students are labeled and can internalize fictitious limitations. I'm not good at math because I'm creative, or I can't be an artist because I'm too logical. These self-limiting beliefs have no neurological basis. Individual differences in cognitive abilities exist, but they are not explained by hemispheric dominance. They result from the complex interaction between genetics, experience, practice, motivation, and the intricate network of connections that forms each unique brain. Reducing this complexity to a simple left-right dichotomy is not only scientifically incorrect but also impoverishes our understanding of human capabilities. Alcohol kills neurons. Few myths about the brain generate as much guilt at college parties as the belief that every alcoholic drink destroys thousands of irreplaceable neurons. This idea is taught in drug education programs and repeated in casual conversations as an established fact. But like many popular facts about the brain, it oversimplifies a complex relationship and partially misinterprets scientific evidence. The myth likely originated in observations of chronic alcoholics' brains during autopsies. These brains showed significant atrophy, especially in the frontal cortex and cerebellum, with deeper sulci and expanded ventricles, fluid-filled cavities. For decades, neuroscientists assumed that this reduction in brain volume reflected massive neuronal death caused directly by alcohol. However, more sophisticated studies revealed a different story. Detailed microscopic studies of alcoholic brains did not find the massive neuronal loss that was expected given the degree of visible atrophy. Instead, they discovered that alcohol primarily damages dendrites, the branches that allow neurons to communicate with each other, and reduces the volume of white matter, the connections between brain regions. Individual neurons mostly survive, but their connections deteriorate, which is equally problematic for cognitive function but potentially more reversible. This does not mean that alcohol is harmless to the brain. Chronic excessive consumption causes real and profound neurological damage. But the mechanism is less about direct neuron death and more about disruption of cerebral neurochemistry, damage to vascular and glial support systems, and the nutritional deficiency associated with alcoholism, particularly of thiamine, vitamin B1. Thiamine deficiency can lead to Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, a devastating disorder that does cause neuronal death in specific regions. Moderate alcohol consumption presents an even more nuanced picture. Large-scale epidemiological studies have suggested that light to moderate consumption could even be associated with a reduced risk of dementia, although more recent studies question this conclusion, suggesting that the apparent benefits might be due to confounding factors like socioeconomic status and healthy behaviors that often accompany moderate drinking. A 2022 study in Nature Communications analyzed magnetic resonance data from more than 25,000 people and found that even moderate alcohol consumption was associated with reductions in gray matter volume in multiple brain regions, including areas involved in emotional processing, decision-making, and memory formation. These findings challenged the notion that there is a safe level of alcohol consumption for brain health. However, the brain shows remarkable recovery capabilities when excessive alcohol consumption ceases. Brain imaging studies of recovering alcoholics show that brain volume can increase significantly within the first weeks and months of abstinence. Cognitive functions improve, especially memory and executive function. Although complete recovery can take years and some deficiencies may persist permanently if the damage was severe. Age also matters significantly. The adolescent brain, still undergoing critical development until the mid-20s, is particularly vulnerable to the effects of alcohol. Episodic excessive consumption during adolescence can alter the development of the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, with potentially lasting consequences for impulse control, planning, and memory. In contrast, the mature adult brain, although not immune, is more resilient. The important message is not that alcohol is harmless because it technically does not kill neurons in the way the myth suggests, but that alcohol-related brain damage is real, cumulative, and potentially serious. The destruction of neural connections and the alteration of neurochemistry can be just as detrimental as direct neuronal loss. The simplification of the myth could ironically trivialize the real risks by focusing on an incorrect mechanism. Listening to Mozart makes babies smarter. In the late 1990s, millions of parents put headphones on their babies with Mozart sonatas, convinced that classical music would increase their children's IQ. The governor of Georgia even proposed a state budget to give free classical music CDs to all newborns. All of this was based on a tremendously distorted interpretation of a small, specific scientific study. The original 1993 study, published in Nature by Francis Rauscher, did not involve babies at all. Researchers worked with university students who listened to Mozart's sonata for two pianos in D major for 10 minutes before performing spatial reasoning tests. The students showed a temporary and modest improvement in a specific task related to the mental visualization of three-dimensional objects. The effect lasted approximately 15 minutes and did not generalize to other cognitive abilities. However, the media transformed these limited findings into sensational headlines about genius babies. The children's entertainment industry capitalized on parental anxiety, generating millions of dollars selling scientifically proven products to increase infant intelligence. The nuances of the original study, short duration, specific task, adult population, were completely lost in translation to the mass market. Subsequent attempts to replicate even the modest results of the original study produced mixed results. A 2010 meta-analysis that examined dozens of studies on the Mozart Effect concluded that any improvement in cognitive performance was likely due to general factors like elevated mood and increased arousal, not to specific properties of Mozart's music. Other musical genres that participants found pleasurable produced similar effects. The neuroplasticity of the infant brain is real and profound, but it does not work through passive exposure to specific stimuli. Babies benefit from environments rich in social interaction, physical exploration, play, and bidirectional verbal communication. Playing Mozart for a baby while they are in their crib does not provide these critical experiences. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends limiting young children's exposure to electronic media, including constant background music, which can interfere with crucial social interactions. Genuine musical education, where children learn to play instruments, read sheet music, and understand music theory, does show documented cognitive benefits. These effects stem from years of deliberate practice that develops discipline, working memory, fine motor coordination, and complex auditory processing. But this is fundamentally different from passive listening to classical music during infancy. The Mozart Effect myth also reflects broader cultural anxieties about child development and educational competitiveness. Parents, bombarded with messages about critical development periods and the fear that their children will fall behind, seek quick and easy solutions. The promise that something as simple as playing music could give their children an advantage proves irresistible, even when the scientific evidence does not support it. Christopher Chabris, a psychologist at Harvard University, described the Mozart effect as one of the most persistent and harmful scientific myths because it distracts from truly effective interventions. Instead of investing time in quality interactions, shared reading, and imaginative play, parents rely on a passive technological solution that offers the illusion of cognitive optimization without the real effort of parental engagement. The irony is that Mozart, who began his musical education very young through active and intensive instruction from his father, would never have achieved his genius through passive listening to music. His development came from countless hours of practice, composition, experimentation, and personalized instruction. If we want music to benefit our children, we must provide them with active and meaningful musical experiences, not simply play classics as background noise. Neurons do not regenerate after birth. For most of the 20th century, neuroscientists taught as irrefutable dogma that we were born with all the neurons we would ever have in life, and that the adult brain was incapable of generating new nerve cells. This belief influenced everything from how brain injuries were treated to expectations about cognitive aging. Then, in the 1990s, researchers discovered they were completely wrong. The paradigm shift began when scientists studying the brains of songbirds noticed that these birds produced new neurons every mating season, correlated with learning new songs. But birds are birds, skeptics argued. Mammals, especially primates, function differently. Then, in 1998, Fred Gage of the Salk Institute definitively demonstrated that the adult human hippocampus generates thousands of new neurons every day through a process called neurogenesis. The discovery was made possible by an ingenious technique. Gage studied the brains of cancer patients who had received injections of a marker called BRDU, bromodioxyuridine, as part of their treatment. This substance incorporates into the DNA of dividing cells, creating a permanent tag. When the patients died and donated their brains for research, Gage found marked cells in the hippocampus, unequivocal proof that new neurons had formed during their adult life. The hippocampus, a brain region crucial for the formation of new memories and learning, is not the only site of adult neurogenesis, although it is the most active. It also occurs in the subventricular zone, which generates neurons that migrate to the olfactory bulb. These discoveries revolutionized our understanding of the brain, moving from viewing it as a static organ after early development to recognizing it as dynamic and adaptable throughout life. However, adult neurogenesis is a more complex topic than optimistic headlines suggest. The number of new neurons generated decreases dramatically with age. A 2018 study in Nature generated controversy by suggesting that hippocampal neurogenesis becomes almost undetectable in older adults, although subsequent studies have questioned this conclusion, arguing that it might be an artifact of the tissue preservation techniques used. What we know for certain is that certain factors promote neurogenesis while others inhibit it. Regular aerobic exercise, especially activities that require complex coordination, significantly increases the production of new neurons. Mice that run on wheels generate twice as many new hippocampal neurons as sedentary mice. Learning new and challenging skills also stimulates neurogenesis, but only if the task requires genuine mental effort. Repetition of already mastered activities does not have the same effect. On the other hand, chronic stress, lack of sleep, a diet high in sugars and saturated fats, and excessive alcohol consumption suppress neurogenesis. Depression has been associated with reduced hippocampal neurogenesis, and interestingly, antidepressants seem to work in part by restoring the production of new neurons, although this effect takes weeks to manifest, which coincides with the time antidepressants need to show clinical benefits. Adult neurogenesis also raises intriguing philosophical questions about identity and memory. If our hippocampi are constantly integrating new neurons, how do we maintain stable long-term memories? Researchers believe that neurogenesis might serve to clear the hippocampus of obsolete information, allowing important memories to consolidate in other brain regions while freeing up capacity for new learning. It is important not to overstate the implications. Neurogenesis represents a small fraction of the total neurons, and many of the new cells die quickly if they do not functionally integrate into existing circuits. It is not a source of cognitive youth or a cure for neurodegenerative diseases, but the mere fact that it occurs challenges the neurological fatalism that dominated previous thought and opens therapeutic possibilities to stimulate brain repair. We have 5 senses. Since elementary school, we are taught the 5 classic senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. This classification, inherited from Aristotle more than 2,000 years ago, persists in modern education even though neuroscientists have identified many more sensory systems that allow the brain to construct our experience of the world. The reality is that we have at least twice as many senses, depending on how we count them. Touch alone is not a single sense but several distinct systems. We have separate receptors for pressure, vibration, temperature, divided into hot and cold, and pain. Each type of sensation is detected by different specialized receptors and processed by distinct neural pathways. A person can lose sensitivity to pain, a rare but real condition called congenital insensitivity to pain, while maintaining intact the perception of temperature and pressure, demonstrating that these are truly separate systems. Then there is proprioception, the sense of our body's position in space. Close your eyes and touch your nose with your finger. Proprioception allows you to know where your hand is without seeing it. This sense relies on receptors in muscles, tendons, and joints that constantly inform the brain about the position and movement of the limbs. People with damage to proprioceptive nerves, such as the famous case of Ian Waterman documented by neurologist Jonathan Cole, lose the ability to control their movements without constant visual observation. Related but distinct is interoception, the sense of the body's internal state. You perceive your heart rate, although usually unconsciously, the fullness of your bladder, the oxygen level in your blood, and dozens of other physiological signals. Interoception plays a crucial role in emotions. Many modern theories of emotion, such as Lisa Feldman Barrett's, argue that emotional feelings emerge in part from the brain's interpretation of interoceptive signals. The sense of balance, vestibular system, deserves recognition as an independent sense. Located in the inner ear, it detects linear and rotational acceleration of the head, allowing us to maintain balance and navigate three-dimensional space. Inner ear infections that damage the vestibular system cause intense vertigo, nausea, and spatial disorientation, demonstrating how fundamental this sense is to normal function. Some animals possess senses that humans completely lack. Rattlesnakes detect infrared radiation with specialized organs, allowing them to see the body heat of prey in total darkness. Sharks perceive weak electric fields produced by other animals' muscles. Pigeons detect magnetic fields to navigate during migration. These examples expand our definition of what constitutes a sense beyond limited human experience. Even within the 5 classic senses, reality is more complex than the simple categories suggest. Taste, for example, is not limited to the 4 traditional categories: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, plus the recently added umami. We have receptors to detect fat, and possibly for calcium and carbonation. Smell is now considered capable of distinguishing at least 1 trillion different odors, much more than previous estimates, and is deeply connected to emotional memory in ways we are just beginning to understand. Synesthesia, a neurological condition where the stimulation of one sense triggers experiences in another, such as seeing colors when listening to music, reveals that the boundaries between senses are blurrier than the Aristotelian classification suggests. Multisensory integration is the norm, not the exception. Our brain constantly combines information from multiple sensory systems to create a coherent experience of the world. Reducing the richness of human sensory experience to 5 arbitrary categories is not only scientifically inaccurate but also impoverishes our appreciation of the brain's sophistication. Every moment of consciousness involves the integration of dozens of sensory flows into a unified experience, an extraordinary computational achievement that we take for granted but that remains beyond the capabilities of any artificial technology. Memories are stored in specific locations. The metaphor of the brain as a computer has generated the intuition that memories must be stored in discrete files in specific locations, waiting to be retrieved intact when we need them. This view of memory as a faithful recording of past experiences is comforting but profoundly misleading. Modern neuroscience reveals that memory is a reconstructive, not reproductive, process, distributed across neural networks and surprisingly malleable. Carl Lashley dedicated decades in the first half of the 20th century to searching for the engram, the physical change in the brain that represents a specific memory. He trained rats in mazes, then systematically destroyed different portions of their cerebral cortices attempting to locate where the maze memories were stored. To his frustration, no specific lesion selectively eliminated the maze memory. The more tissue he destroyed, the worse the rat's performance, but the effect seemed to depend on the amount of damage, not the specific location. Lashley concluded that memories are distributed throughout the cortex, a principle he called equipotentiality. Although this conclusion was too extreme, we now know that different brain regions contribute in specific ways to different types of memory. It captured a fundamental truth. Memories do not exist as discrete entities in unique locations but as patterns of activation across dispersed neural networks. The most famous case in memory neuroscience, patient HM, revealed that the hippocampus is crucial for forming new declarative memories, facts and events, but it is not where they are permanently stored. After his hippocampus was surgically removed bilaterally to treat severe epilepsy, HM lost the ability to form new long-term memories but retained memories of his distant past. This suggests that the hippocampus acts as a temporary index that gradually transfers memories to cortical regions for long-term storage through a process called consolidation. But even consolidation does not freeze memories permanently. Every time we recall something, the memory temporarily becomes labile and susceptible to modification before reconsolidating. This process, discovered by Karim Nader in 2000, transformed our understanding of memory. It showed that memories are not like books in a library that are consulted without changing, but rather like Wikipedia pages that are slightly rewritten every time they are accessed. Elizabeth Loftus has spent decades documenting the malleability of human memory. In classic experiments, she showed that simply changing one word in a question can alter people's memories of witnessed events. Witnesses to a car accident reported higher speeds when asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed versus when they made contact. More disturbing, Loftus has shown that it is possible to implant completely false memories of events that never occurred, such as getting lost in a shopping mall during childhood. The implications for the legal system are deep and concerning. Eyewitness testimony, traditionally considered very persuasive evidence, is notoriously unreliable. People can remember with absolute confidence events they never witnessed. Suggestive interrogations can inadvertently contaminate memories. Lineup identifications of suspects can create false memories that replace genuine memories of the original perpetrator. Memory is also selective in ways that favor narrative coherence over factual accuracy. We tend to recall information consistent with our current beliefs and reinterpret past memories to align them with our present identity. Longitudinal studies comparing early descriptions of events with later memories reveal that people unconsciously alter their memories to better fit how they see themselves now. Different types of memory, episodic, semantic, procedural, emotional, involve distinct neural systems and are stored in different ways. Intense emotional memories, recorded during traumatic or very positive events, involve the amygdala and tend to be more vivid and persistent, although not necessarily more accurate. Procedural memory for motor skills, riding a bicycle, playing the piano, is stored in the basal ganglia and cerebellum, and is remarkably resistant to conscious forgetting even when not practiced for years. Understanding that memories are reconstructions, not recordings, has existential implications. Our personal identity is built upon an autobiographical narrative based on memories that are partially fictitious and constantly rewritten. This does not mean that all memory is fiction or that we cannot trust our memories at all, but it does require epistemic humility about the reliability of our access to the past. The brain is like a computer. This analogy dominates both popular discourse and much of cognitive science. We talk about processing information, storing data, and retrieving files as if the brain were merely biological hardware running mental software. The metaphor is so intuitive and ubiquitous that we forget it is precisely that, a metaphor. And like all metaphors, it illuminates certain aspects while obscuring others, potentially more important ones. Computers operate by manipulating discrete symbols according to explicit algorithmic rules. Processing is sequential, though massively parallelized in modern systems, deterministic, and separable into hardware and software components. Fundamental operations are logical, mathematical, and disconnected from meaning. A computer that sums numbers does not understand mathematics any more than a beam supporting weight understands structural engineering. The brain operates under radically different principles. There is no separation between hardware and software. The brain's physical structure and its programs are inseparable. Learning something new literally changes the physical architecture of the brain through synaptic strengthening, connection pruning, and potentially neurogenesis. There is no cerebral programming code readable in a language interpretable independently of the biological substrate. While computers process information through precise calculations, the brain operates through statistical approximation and pattern recognition. Individual neurons are noisy and unreliable. Cerebral computation emerges from the collective activity of millions of neurons whose individual discharges contain considerable randomness. This apparent weakness is actually a strength. It allows the brain to handle ambiguous, incomplete, or contradictory information in ways that traditional computers find difficult. Neuroscientist Gerald Edelman proposed that the brain operates not through computer-like information processing but through selection, analogous to Darwinian evolution. During development and learning, neural connections proliferate, and then those that prove functional are selected while useless ones are eliminated. This selective process is fundamentally different from the instructive design that characterizes computational programming. The computational analogy also misinterprets the nature of neural representation. Computers represent information using arbitrary codes. The number 5 might be encoded as 101 in binary, but this representation has no inherent relationship to fiveness. In the brain, representations are fundamentally connected to sensorimotor experience. Our concept of dog is not an abstract symbol but a distributed network involving visual memories of dogs, sounds of barking, tactile sensations of fur, associated emotions, and even motor preparation for interacting with dogs. More fundamentally, computers process but do not experience. There is no something that it feels like to be a computer running a program, no matter how complex. The brain, in contrast, generates subjective experience. The red of a sunset, the pain of a burn, the joy of reunion. This problem of consciousness, the hard problem, in the terminology of philosopher David Chalmers, is not even close to being solved by computational analogies. The history of cognitive science is marked by successive technological metaphors. Before the computer, the brain was compared to telephone systems or telegraph circuits. Before that, to hydraulic machines or clockwork mechanisms. Each technological era projects its most sophisticated tools onto the brain, revealing as much about our cultural concerns as about actual neurobiology. Modern researchers of artificial neural networks sometimes fall into the inverse error, assuming that because artificial neural networks were vaguely inspired by neurobiology, they reveal how the real brain works. But artificial neurons are extremely simplified mathematical abstractions. Biological neurons are complex dynamic systems with dozens of receptor types, release multiple neurotransmitters, exhibit firing time-dependent plasticity, and possess intrinsic computational properties that no artificial neuron captures. Abandoning the computational metaphor does not mean rejecting scientific rigor or mathematical modeling of the brain. It means recognizing that the brain is a biological system that evolved through natural selection to solve problems of survival and reproduction, not to run algorithms. It operates through chemistry as much as electricity, is deeply integrated with the body, and generates embodied meaning rather than manipulating abstract symbols. Truly understanding the brain will require new concepts we can barely imagine today, not simply applying metaphors from our current technology. We learn better with our preferred learning style. The learning styles theory holds that each person has a preferred modality, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, and learns best when instruction matches that preference. This idea has infiltrated educational systems globally, generating entire industries of learning style assessment and differentiated curriculum development. The only problem is that decades of rigorous educational research have not found substantial evidence that tailoring instruction to supposed learning styles improves educational outcomes. The appeal of the theory is obvious. It validates subjective experiences. Some people feel they learn better by seeing diagrams than by hearing explanations, and offers simple explanations for learning difficulties. The problem is neither the student nor the teacher, but the mismatch between teaching style and learning style. It is also appealing because it personalizes education in an era that values individuality. The problem is that personal preferences for certain types of information do not translate into better learning when instruction is adapted to those preferences. A 2008 study by Pashler and colleagues, published in Psychological Science in the Public Interest, exhaustively reviewed the literature on learning styles. The authors established a clear standard. To validate the theory, studies would need to show an interaction between learning style and instruction method, where visual students learn better with visual instruction and worse with verbal instruction, while auditory students show the opposite pattern. Of hundreds of reviewed studies, virtually none met this basic criterion. Studies typically found that certain teaching methods worked best for all students regardless of their supposed learning style. For example, diagrams helped everyone understand complex spatial concepts, not just visual learners. Verbal explanations benefited everyone when learning grammar, not just auditory learners. More revealing still, the effectiveness of different instruction methods depends much more on the content being taught than on the characteristics of the learner. To teach geography, maps work better than verbal descriptions for everyone. To teach foreign language pronunciation, audio is superior to visual representations of phonemes. The material dictates the method, not the student's supposed style. More recent studies have attempted to measure whether people truly learn better when taught according to their self-reported preferred modality. Consistently, these studies find no advantage. In one experiment, students who identified as visual or verbal learners studied material presented visually or verbally. Both groups recalled material better when presented with images and words together, regardless of their declared preference. Neuroscientifically, the learning styles theory also makes no sense. There are no separate brain regions for visual learning versus auditory learning that work in isolation. Visual and auditory processing initially involve distinct neural pathways but rapidly converge and integrate. Complex learning always activates distributed networks that cross sensory modalities. Even when we only hear words, we activate visual representations of the concepts described. The damage of this educational myth is not trivial. Teachers spend limited time and resources trying to diagnose learning styles and create multiple versions of lessons for different types of students. Students may develop self-limiting beliefs. I can't learn math because I'm a kinesthetic learner and math is visual. Opportunities to use genuinely effective learning strategies that work for everyone are lost. What really works? Evidence supports universal principles of effective learning. Retrieval practice, testing oneself, study spacing, interleaving different types of problems, self-explanation, and connecting new material to prior knowledge. These strategies improve learning regardless of supposed stylistic preferences. Effective pedagogy also requires aligning the method with the content. Using visualizations for spatial concepts, verbal representations for abstract concepts, and practical experiences for motor skills. Real individual differences in learning exist, of course. People differ in prior knowledge, working memory capacity, processing speed, motivation, and dozens of other variables that impact learning. But these differences do not reduce to 3 or 4 discrete styles. The human brain is too complex for that. We are born with all our musical talent. The idea of musical ear, as an innate gift that some possess and others permanently lack, has convinced countless people that they can never sing in tune or play instruments. This belief is reinforced when we see child prodigies demonstrating extraordinary musical abilities, seeming to confirm that musical talent is something you are born with or not. The science of musical learning tells a different story. The paradigmatic case of musical prodigies, exemplified by Mozart, is more complex than it appears. Mozart certainly had exceptional talent, but he also received intensive musical instruction from age 3 from his father Leopold, an experienced composer and pedagogue. By age 6, when Mozart began to astonish the world, he had already accumulated thousands of hours of practice under expert supervision. His early compositions, while impressive for his age, were typical of the period and genre, not revolutionary masterpieces. His true innovations came after another decade of development. Studies by psychologist Anders Ericsson on elite musicians revealed that the achieved level of expertise is strongly predicted by the hours of accumulated deliberate practice, not by early indicators of natural talent. World-class violinists typically accumulated over 10,000 hours of intensive practice before age 20, compared to significantly fewer hours for professional but non-elite musicians. While controversial, these findings challenged the narrative of innate talent as the sole determinant factor. The ability to perceive pitch exists on a spectrum. Absolute pitch, the ability to identify or produce musical notes without external reference, is rare in Western populations, less than 1%, but much more common among trained musicians in cultures where tonal languages, like Mandarin or Vietnamese, are native. This suggests that absolute pitch can be developed during critical early developmental periods when the brain is particularly plastic, not that it is exclusively genetic. Relative pitch, the ability to identify intervals between notes, more musically important than absolute pitch, is trainable in virtually anyone with normal hearing. Systematic auditory training programs consistently improve pitch, rhythm, and timbre discrimination. Most people who consider themselves tone deaf simply lack experience coordinating their vocal apparatus with the pitch they hear, a problem of vocal motor training, not auditory perception. The brains of professional musicians show consistent structural differences compared to non-musicians. Greater gray matter volume in motor, auditory, and visual regions relevant to musical performance. Greater white matter integrity in tracks connecting these regions, and expansion of the corpus callosum that facilitates coordination between hemispheres. Crucially, Longitudinal studies of children starting musical training show that these differences emerge with practice, not that they pre-exist in those who choose to study music. The starting time of musical training matters. Children who start before age 7 show greater neuroplastic changes than those who start later, consistent with sensitive periods of brain development where learning is more efficient. However, the adult brain retains considerable capacity for musical learning. Adults can learn instruments, improve auditory discrimination, and develop musical sophistication, although they typically require more time than children to reach equivalent competency levels. Real individual differences in ease of musical learning exist and likely have genetic components. Some aspects of auditory processing, working memory, and fine motor control vary among individuals for partially heritable reasons. But these differences affect the speed of learning and the maximum potential ceiling, not whether learning is possible. Most people could achieve functional musical competence, playing pieces accurately, singing in tune, improvising simple melodies, with appropriate training, even if they won't become world-class virtuosos. The problem is that conventional musical education often fails to provide this appropriate training. School music classes frequently assume that students arrive with basic perceptive skills already developed, marginalizing those who did not grow up in musically rich environments. Critical feedback without technical instruction on how to improve "you're out of tune" without teaching vocal pitch control reinforces beliefs of immutable incompetence. Innovative pedagogical methods like Suzuki or Kodali demonstrate that children of average ability can reach notable levels of musicianship with systematic instruction that starts from basic principles. The success of these methods does not prove that talent is irrelevant, but it does demonstrate that structured instruction matters enormously and that the range of possible outcomes is much wider than conventional beliefs about innate talent suggest. Reading in the dark damages eyesight. Generations of parents have warned their children against reading in dim light, convinced that they would permanently ruin their eyes. This concern seems reasonable. Straining to see in low-light conditions causes temporary eye fatigue, dry eyes, and headaches. But temporary fatigue does not equal permanent damage. Ophthalmologists are almost unanimous. Reading in the dark does not damage vision or cause structural changes in the eye. The eye continuously adapts to different light levels by adjusting pupillary size and retinal sensitivity. In dark conditions, the pupils dilate to let in more light, and the rods, photoreceptor cells specialized in night vision, become more active. These changes are normal adaptations, not signs of damage. Reading in dim light simply requires the visual system to work harder to resolve details, similar to how walking uphill requires more muscular effort but does not damage the legs. The resulting eye fatigue from reading in low-light conditions is real and uncomfortable. The muscles that control focus, accommodation, and ocular convergence tire with sustained effort. People blink less when concentrating on reading, causing eye dryness. These symptoms disappear with rest. There is no evidence that they cause myopia, cataracts, macular degeneration, or any other permanent eye problem. The confusion might come from misinterpreted observational correlations. Children who read extensively in any light condition are at higher risk of developing myopia, not because of the illumination but because of the prolonged time spent focusing on near objects. The myopia epidemic in modern societies is mainly attributed to excessive near-visual work and insufficient time outdoors where the eyes focus at varied distances. Illumination is irrelevant to this effect. In fact, excessively bright light can be more problematic than dim light in certain contexts. Prolonged exposure to bright blue light from digital screens can interfere with circadian rhythms and sleep quality, particularly when used before bedtime. Excessive glare causes discomfort and reduces visual contrast. Moderate and diffuse lighting is generally optimal for prolonged reading. Modern ophthalmological recommendations emphasize the 20-20-20 rule for any near-visual work. Every 20 minutes, look at something 20 feet away, approximately 6 meters, for 20 seconds. This allows the accommodation muscles to relax. Consciously blinking prevents eye dryness. Maintaining an appropriate distance from reading material, 40 to 50 centimeters, reduces effort. These principles apply regardless of the illumination level. The persistence of this myth probably reflects the confusion between temporary discomfort and permanent damage, a distinction that is not always intuitive. It may also originate from eras when light sources were problematic, flickering candles, kerosene lamps that produced smoke, and dim lighting was associated with generally unhealthy conditions. In the modern era with stable electric light sources, reading in dim light is simply less comfortable, not harmful. Stress causes gray hair. The image of the president who enters office with dark hair and emerges years later completely gray is frequently invoked as proof that stress causes graying. This appealing narrative intuitively connects emotional wear and tear with visible physical markers of aging. However, the biology of hair color is more complex than this simple explanation suggests. Hair color comes from melanin produced by specialized cells called melanocytes located in hair follicles. With age, these melanocytes gradually lose function and eventually die, resulting in pigmentless hairs that appear gray or white. This process is strongly influenced by genetics. If your parents grayed early, you probably will too, regardless of your stress levels. Studies attempting to correlate stress with premature graying yield inconsistent results. Some find weak associations, but these studies typically cannot separate stress from other correlated factors like age, diet, smoking, and underlying medical conditions. Comparisons of identical twins under different levels of reported stress do not show consistent differences in graying. However, recent research suggests plausible biological mechanisms by which extreme stress could accelerate graying. A 2020 study in Nature demonstrated in mice that acute stress causes depletion of melanocyte stem cells in hair follicles through activation of the sympathetic nervous system. The norepinephrine released during stress responses causes the stem cells to prematurely differentiate into melanocytes, exhausting the regenerative reserve. But extrapolation from mice to humans requires caution. Mice live for years, humans for decades. Human hair follicles spend years in the active growth phase before entering rest and shedding phases. Human graying occurs gradually over years or decades, not suddenly. Stories of people who supposedly went gray overnight from trauma, like Marie Antoinette before her execution, are apocryphal or explainable by alopecia areata, a condition that causes selective shedding of pigmented hair, leaving only pre-existing white hairs. Certain medical conditions do cause premature graying. Vitamin B12 deficiencies, thyroid problems, vitiligo, and alopecia areata. Smoking is consistently associated with premature graying, likely due to oxidative stress. But chronic psychological stress, however real and impactful it is on mental health and the cardiovascular and immune systems, does not have demonstrated dramatic effects on hair pigmentation. The confusion likely arises because graying naturally accelerates during typically stressful periods of life, middle age with professional and family pressures, creating spurious correlations. Political leaders gray during their terms not because the office is stressful, although it is, but because they typically hold these roles during their 50s and 60s, when genetically programmed graying naturally accelerates. There is also confirmation bias. We remember instances where people under stress grayed but ignore numerous counterexamples of people who faced terrible traumas without accelerated graying, or people who grayed prematurely while living relatively tranquil lives. Selective attention to confirming evidence perpetuates the myth. We use more brain when we sleep than when we are awake. This assertion inverts reality. The brain does not rest during sleep in the sense of significantly reducing metabolic activity, but nor does it become more active than during wakefulness. Sleep represents a different state of cerebral activity, not a state of greater general activation. Cerebral metabolism during slow-wave sleep decreases approximately 25 to 40% compared to quiet wakefulness. The origin of this myth can be traced to misunderstandings about REM, rapid eye movement, sleep. During REM, certain brain regions show activity comparable to or even higher than wakefulness in neuroimaging scans. But REM sleep represents only 20 to 25% of total sleep in adults. The rest consists of non-REM sleep at various depths, during which cerebral activity substantially decreases. During slow-wave sleep, the deepest non-REM phase, the electroencephalogram shows slow, high-amplitude waves that reflect massive synchronization of cortical neurons oscillating between active and silent states. This synchronization represents reduced information processing compared to the desynchronized and variable pattern of wakefulness. Individual neurons fire less frequently during deep sleep than during active wakefulness. What the brain does during sleep is qualitatively different, not quantitatively more. Sleep plays crucial roles in memory consolidation, where daytime experiences are replayed and integrated into existing knowledge networks. The glymphatic system, discovered in 2013, becomes more active during sleep, eliminating metabolic waste products that accumulate during wakefulness, including proteins associated with Alzheimer's. REM sleep shows fascinating brain activation patterns. Visual, motor, and emotional regions are intensely activated, generating the vivid experiences of dreams. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex, involved in logical thought and reality evaluation, shows reduced activity, explaining why dreams seem coherent while they occur but evidently illogical upon recall. This reorganization of activity does not mean greater total activity. Metabolic studies using positron emission tomography, PET, measure cerebral glucose consumption, a direct indicator of metabolic activity. These studies consistently show that global cerebral metabolism decreases during non-REM sleep compared with wakefulness. During REM sleep, metabolism increases relative to non-REM sleep but generally does not exceed quiet wakefulness levels. The question of whether the brain works more during sleep versus wakefulness is ill-posed because it assumes that greater activity equals more work or greater importance. Sleep is not wasted time or merely passive rest. It is an active state where specific processes critical for health and cognitive function occur. But these processes do not require more total metabolic energy than wakefulness. Sleep deprivation causes profound cognitive impairment, demonstrating that sleep is essential. After 24 hours without sleep, cognitive performance deteriorates equivalently to having a blood alcohol level of 0.1%, legally intoxicated in most jurisdictions. Chronic sleep deprivation is associated with increased risk of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, and dementia. These effects do not stem from using less brain during sleep but from disrupting specific biological processes that require sleep. Sugar causes hyperactivity in children. Any parent who has organized a child's birthday party knows that sugar transforms quiet children into uncontrollable whirlwinds. This belief is so deeply rooted that many parents limit sweets before situations that require good behavior. However, decades of rigorous scientific research have found no evidence that sugar causes hyperactivity or exacerbates attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. The most cited study on this topic is a 1995 meta-analysis published in JAMA that reviewed 23 controlled experiments. These studies used double-blind designs where neither the parents nor the researchers knew which children received sugar versus placebo, artificial sweeteners. The results were clear. Sugar consumption did not increase objective measures of physical activity, attention, or problematic behavior in children with or without an ADHD diagnosis. More revealing was a component of some studies where parents were, incorrectly, informed that their children had received large amounts of sugar when they had actually received a placebo. Parents reported significantly more hyperactivity in these children and rated them as more active in behavioral observations, demonstrating powerful expectation effects. Parents who believe sugar causes hyperactivity see hyperactivity even when no sugar is present. So, why does the belief persist so strongly despite the evidence? Birthday parties and celebrations where children consume sweets also involve social excitement, stimulating games, lack of structure, and unusual freedom from normal rules. The context, not the sugar, explains the elevated behavior. Sugar becomes a convenient scapegoat because it is visible and controllable, whereas the social context is complex and difficult to modify. The biochemistry of sugar metabolism does not support the hyperactivity hypothesis. Sugar provides energy that the brain and body constantly use. The body carefully regulates blood glucose levels through insulin and other hormonal mechanisms. A brief spike in glucose after consuming sweets has no known mechanism to increase motor activity or reduce impulse control. In fact, low glucose levels, hypoglycemia, cause irritability and difficulty concentrating, not hyperactivity. A real concept exists called a sugar crash, where after consuming large amounts of simple carbohydrates, glucose levels drop quickly when insulin overcompensates. But this causes lethargy and bad mood, not hyperactivity. People experience this as fatigue and difficulty concentrating, the opposite of the hyperactive behavior that sugar is supposed to cause. Some children have genuine sensitivities to food additives like artificial colorings. A 2007 study found that certain colorings and the preservative sodium benzoate increased hyperactivity in some children. But these effects do not come from sugar per se but from specific chemicals often found in sugary foods. The solution would be to avoid those specific additives, not sugar in general. Sugar has real health problems. It contributes to dental caries, obesity, when consumed in excess of caloric needs, and potentially long-term metabolic diseases. There are legitimate reasons to limit sugar consumption in children. But hyperactivity is not one of them. Blaming sugar for difficult behavior distracts from real causal factors like unmet sleep needs, overstimulation, lack of structure, or underlying developmental or behavioral issues. Parents anecdotally report that their individual children show sensitivity to sugar. These reports likely reflect a combination of expectation factors, selective attention to post-sweet behavior while ignoring similar behavior at other times, and confusion between correlation and causation. Controlled studies that eliminate these biases consistently find no effect. Listening to music while studying improves learning. Students worldwide study with background music, convinced that it improves concentration and retention. The music for studying industry on streaming platforms generates millions of plays. But the scientific evidence on the effects of background music on learning is complex and mostly unfavorable, especially for tasks that require intense verbal processing. The fundamental problem is that music and language compete for limited cognitive resources. The brain is not truly capable of multitasking. It quickly alternates between tasks or processes both superficially. When you try to read or study verbal material, which includes most academic content, while listening to music with lyrics, your linguistic processing system must handle two simultaneous streams of information. Studies comparing performance on reading comprehension tasks under different auditory conditions consistently find that music with lyrics reduces comprehension and recall compared to silence. The effect is especially pronounced when the music is in a language the listener understands. Lyrics automatically capture linguistic processing resources even when you try to ignore them. Instrumental music shows more mixed effects. For relatively simple and repetitive tasks, background music can improve performance, likely by increasing alertness and reducing boredom. However, for complex learning that requires deep processing, concept integration, and problem-solving, even instrumental music can interfere, particularly if it is musically complex or emotionally intense. The irrelevant sound effect describes how varying background sounds disrupt working memory for ordered sequences. This effect applies to music and also to background conversations, variable traffic noise, and other changing sounds. Constant white noise or constant ambient natural sounds, rain waves, interfere less because they do not contain temporal variation that captures attention. However, significant individual variability exists. Some people genuinely report studying better with music, and their preferences might reflect differences in personality, working memory capacity, or auditory sensitivity. Extroverts may benefit more from moderate background stimulation than introverts. People with high working memory capacity might better manage the dual load. Crucially, what feels productive does not always correspond to objective learning. Students frequently report that music helps them concentrate, but subsequent retention tests show they learned less. Music can make studying feel more pleasant and reduce the perception of effort, which keeps people studying longer, but each hour of study is less efficient. For certain activities, music offers clear benefits. Physical exercise is improved by energizing music that boosts motivation and masks fatigue. Open-ended creative tasks that require divergent thinking can benefit from music that induces positive moods. But studying for exams, writing essays, or learning complex technical material generally benefits more from silence or, at most, non-intrusive ambient sound. The practical, evidence-based advice. If you are going to use music while studying, choose simple instrumental music, keep it at a low volume, and use it strategically. When taking breaks, music can boost mood and energy. For rote memorization tasks that do not require deep processing, music might be neutral or slightly beneficial. But for complex learning that requires your full cognitive attention, silence is golden. Video games rot the brain. Concerned parents have warned for decades that video games turn the brain to mush, reduce attention spans, and promote violence. This narrative peaked in the 1990s and 2000s with moral panic over violent games. However, neuropsychological research reveals a much more nuanced picture where certain types of games produce measurable cognitive benefits while other usage patterns present real risks. Let's start with the good news. Well-designed action games improve multiple cognitive abilities. Studies by Daphne Bavelier and colleagues demonstrated that playing fast-paced action games improves selective visual attention, the ability to track multiple objects simultaneously, spatial attention, noticing events in peripheral vision, and perceptual processing speed. Experienced action game players outperform non-players in these tasks by significant margins. More impressively, training studies show that these differences are not simply selection. People with better visual attention choose to play video games, but causal. When non-players are trained on action games for 10 to 50 hours, they show significant improvements in visual attention measures that generalize to other tasks, suggesting changes in fundamental cognitive abilities, not just game-specific learning. Strategy and puzzle games offer different benefits. Real-time strategy games require planning, managing multiple resources, and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Studies find that playing these games improves cognitive flexibility and working memory. Puzzles like Tetris improve visuospatial skills and, curiously, may interfere with the consolidation of traumatic memories when played shortly after stressful events, offering therapeutic potential for PTSD prevention. Neuroimaging of habitual players shows structural and functional differences. Greater gray matter volume in regions involved in spatial attention, strategic planning, and fine motor skills. Greater activation of attention networks during relevant tasks, and improved connectivity between brain regions that must coordinate for optimal performance. Now, the nuances and legitimate concerns. Excessive video game use can be problematic. Gaming disorder was recognized by the WHO in 2018 when gaming interferes with other areas of life, relationships, work, school, health, despite negative consequences. The prevalence is low, estimated at 1 to 3% of players, but real, particularly for games deliberately designed with addictive mechanics like variable rewards and infinite progression. The research on video games and aggression is contentious and politically charged. Meta-analyses find small correlations between playing violent games and measures of short-term aggression in the laboratory, but these correlations are weak and do not demonstrate direct causality of real violence. Violent crime among youth has decreased dramatically since the 1990s while video game playing exploded, the opposite of what the simple causality hypothesis would predict. Activity displacement is a more valid concern than direct brain damage. The hours dedicated to video games are hours not dedicated to physical exercise, face-to-face social interaction, reading, or being outdoors. For healthy development, children need a variety of experiences. The problem is not that video games are inherently harmful but that excessive use displaces necessary complementary activities. The effects on sleep deserve attention. Playing video games before bed, especially stimulating or competitive games, can delay sleep onset and reduce sleep quality due to psychological arousal and exposure to blue light from screens. Given that sleep is crucial for memory consolidation and brain health, this indirect effect might be more problematic than any direct effect of gaming. The evidence-based conclusion: video games do not rot the brain and can offer cognitive benefits when used moderately and selectively. The risks come from excessive use that interferes with other developmental needs, not from direct neurological damage. As with most technologies, the context of use matters more than the technology itself. We need 8 hours of continuous sleep. The universal prescription of 8 hours of continuous sleep per night is treated as a mutable biological law, and those who sleep less or more worry about suffering terrible health consequences. However, the history of human sleep and anthropological research suggests that the consolidated 8-hour sleep pattern is partially a cultural construct of the industrial age, not necessarily the optimal universal human pattern. Historian Roger Kirch extensively documented that in pre-industrial Europe, the common pattern was biphasic sleep. People slept in 2 separate blocks of approximately 4 hours each with a period of wakefulness between them. During this nocturnal wakefulness, typically 1 to 2 hours, people performed quiet activities: prayer, reflection, conversation with a spouse, or creative activities. This pattern seems to have been so common that it was barely mentioned, considered normal. The arrival of efficient artificial lighting and standardized industrial work schedules gradually consolidated sleep into a single nightly block. Biphasic sleep did not disappear because it was unhealthy but because it was incompatible with factory workdays and fixed schedules. Maintenance insomnia, where people wake up in the middle of the night, might in some cases reflect the expression of this ancestral pattern, not necessarily a disorder. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies reveal diverse sleep patterns. Some societies show more fragmented sleep with flexible rest periods. Average sleep duration varies, generally 6.5 to 7.5 hours, but rarely reaches 8 hours. Daytime naps are common in warm climates. Humans seem to adapt sleep patterns to ecological and cultural demands within biological limits. Individual variability in sleep needs is substantial and partially genetic. Rare mutations of the December 2nd gene allow some people to function optimally with 4 to 6 hours of sleep without adverse consequences, the true short sleepers. Others genuinely need 9 to 10 hours to function well. Most people fall into the 7 to 9 hour range, but the magic number of 8 is an average, not a universal prescription. Sleep architecture matters as much as total duration. Sleep progresses through cycles of approximately 90 minutes that alternate between light sleep, deep sleep, slow waves, and REM sleep. Each type of sleep has distinct functions. Waking during deep sleep causes intense sleep inertia, that groggy feeling, while waking between cycles or during light sleep feels more natural. Some people sleep 7 hours but complete all necessary cycles. Others sleep 8 hours but experience fragmented and superficial sleep. Sleep quality can be more important than pure quantity. Factors that degrade quality include sleep apnea, alcohol consumption, which fragments sleep and suppresses REM, inappropriate room temperature, noise, light, and psychological stress. A person who sleeps 6 hours of uninterrupted deep sleep might function better than someone who is in bed 8 hours but sleeps superficially with frequent awakenings. Sleep timing also matters due to circadian rhythms. Chronotypes vary genetically. Some people are genuinely morning larks who naturally sleep and wake early, while others are night owls who function better with delayed schedules. Forcing a night owl to follow a lark schedule, or vice versa, reduces sleep quality even if the duration is adequate. Social jet lag, where the work-sleep schedule misaligns the natural circadian rhythm, causes cumulative health problems. Sleep needs also vary by life stage. Teenagers need more sleep, 8 to 10 hours, and experience a natural circadian delay. They become more nocturnal, making early school schedules biologically inappropriate. Older adults frequently sleep less deeply and wake up more during the night, but this may be normal adaptation, not pathology requiring treatment. The conclusion is that 8 hours is a useful rough guide, not an absolute biological mandate. Pay attention to how you feel. If you wake up naturally feeling rested, function well during the day without excessive sleepiness, and maintain good health, you are probably getting enough sleep regardless of whether it is 7, 8, or 9 hours. Anxiety about getting exactly 8 hours can paradoxically worsen sleep. The brain works better under pressure. "I work better under pressure" is a common assertion, especially among procrastinators who rationalize leaving everything until the last minute. The narrative romanticizes deadline pressure as a catalyst for creativity and peak performance. But the neuroscience of stress tells a more complex story where cognitive performance follows an inverted U-shaped curve described by the Yerkes-Dodson law. Performance improves with moderate stress but deteriorates under excessive stress. Acute stress causes the release of cortisol and norepinephrine, which at moderate levels improve attention, memory consolidation, and physical energy. Evolutionarily, the stress response prepares the body and brain to deal with immediate threats. This state of heightened alertness can effectively improve performance on simple, well-practiced tasks, or those requiring speed over precision. However, high stress negatively affects prefrontal cortex executive functions. Planning, complex decision-making, flexible thinking, and inhibitory control. Under intense pressure, the brain shifts gear to more automatic processing controlled by subcortical regions. This is useful for immediate survival responses, fleeing danger, but destructive for complex cognitive work that requires deliberate thought. Studies of cognitive performance under stress consistently show impairment in tasks requiring working memory, shifting attention between tasks, and creative problem-solving. Students who report high anxiety before exams typically perform below their capacity, not because they do not know the material but because stress interferes with information retrieval and clear reasoning. The phenomenon of choking under pressure is well documented in sports and other performance domains. Experienced athletes suddenly make basic mistakes at crucial moments. Professional musicians have memory lapses in important recitals. The mechanism involves overactivation of conscious self-monitoring that interferes with automated processes that normally function implicitly. Why, then, do so many people insist they work better under pressure? Multiple cognitive biases explain this perception. First, deadlines force the initiation of tasks that would otherwise be avoided, creating the illusion that pressure caused productivity when it was really the inevitability of consequences. Second, urgency provides clear focus that eliminates distractions, but this focus could be achieved through voluntary discipline without the need for extreme stress. Third, there is availability bias. We vividly recall the occasions where we successfully finished projects at the last minute, memorable because it was dramatic, but forget the multiple instances where last-minute work resulted in inferior quality, errors, or complete failure. Fourth, the intense emotional experience associated with working under pressure can be mistaken for superior performance even when objective quality is lower. Procrastination frequently coexists with perfectionism. People avoid starting because they fear they will not meet their own high standards. The impending deadline provides a convenient excuse. If I had had more time, it would have been perfect. This protects the ego but prevents genuine learning and improvement. Work done with adequate time for planning, revision, and refinement almost always surpasses last-minute work, even if the latter may feel more exciting. Chronic stress, distinct from occasional acute stress, is unequivocally harmful to brain function. Chronically elevated cortisol causes hippocampal atrophy, interferes with neurogenesis, and impairs memory and learning. Chronic inflammation associated with stress damages cerebral blood vessels. The long-term health consequences are serious. Increased risk of depression, anxiety, cardiovascular diseases, and dementia. The optimal, science-based strategy is to maintain moderate levels of stress/arousal through self-imposed challenges and realistic deadlines, avoiding both bored complacency and overwhelming pressure. The flow state described by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi occurs when the task challenge perfectly matches the individual's skills, creating focused engagement without excessive anxiety. This state, not crisis pressure, represents optimal cognitive performance. Alcohol permanently kills neurons. Although we briefly addressed this myth earlier, it deserves deeper exploration because the consequences of chronic alcoholism are real and serious. Only the mechanism is not the simple mass neuronal death that the myth suggests. The reality is more complex. Alcohol damages the brain in multiple ways, some reversible and others not, depending on the severity and duration of the abuse. Post-mortem studies of chronic alcoholic brains initially revealed dramatic cerebral atrophy, expanded ventricles, deep sulci, and loss of cortical volume. Researchers naturally assumed that this volume reduction reflected direct neuronal death. However, when neuroscientists counted neurons using modern stereological techniques, they discovered that the total number of neurons did not decrease proportionally to the volume loss. What, then, explained the atrophy? Alcohol damages dendrites and synapses long before it kills neurons. Dendrites, the branches that receive signals from other neurons, retract and lose dendritic spines, the sites of synapses, with chronic alcohol consumption. This reduces functional connectivity without eliminating the neurons themselves. Alcoholic brains also show demyelination, damage to the myelin sheaths that insulate axons, reducing the speed and efficiency of neural transmission. The prefrontal cortex, crucial for decision-making, impulse control, and planning, is particularly vulnerable. Alcoholics show frontal cortical thinning correlated with deficits in executive functions. The hippocampus, essential for forming new memories, also suffers significant damage, explaining blackouts where the person functions but forms no memories of the intoxication period. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome represents the devastating extreme of alcoholic brain damage. This condition results not from alcohol directly but from thiamine, vitamin B1, deficiency that frequently occurs in alcoholics who obtain calories mainly from alcohol and neglect nutrition. Thiamine deficiency causes permanent neuronal death in specific regions: mammillary bodies, thalamus, and cerebellum. Patients develop severe amnesia, confabulation, creating false memories without intent to deceive, and coordination problems. The good news is that much of the alcohol-related brain damage is reversible with abstinence. Neuroimaging studies of recovering alcoholics show that brain volume begins to recover within weeks of abstinence. Dendrites regenerate, synapses reform, and cognitive function gradually improves. Recovery is more complete in younger people and those with shorter periods of abuse. However, recovery is neither complete nor immediate. Some cognitive deficits persist years after abstinence, particularly in memory and executive functions. The adolescent brain, still undergoing critical development, is especially vulnerable to the lasting effects of excessive alcohol consumption. Binge drinking during adolescence can alter the development of the prefrontal cortex with consequences that persist into adulthood. Alcohol also increases the risk of stroke through multiple mechanisms. Elevated blood pressure, cardiac arrhythmias, and coagulopathy. Strokes do cause massive neuronal death in regions deprived of blood flow. Additionally, alcohol contributes to dementia through cumulative vascular damage and possibly by accelerating Alzheimer's pathologies. Quantity matters dramatically. Moderate consumption, typically defined as a maximum of 1 drink per day for women, 2 for men, shows different risk profiles than excessive consumption. Epidemiological studies have suggested cardiovascular protective effects of moderate consumption, although recent research questions whether these benefits are real or artifacts of confounding factors. Even if moderate consumption has some cardiovascular benefits, any level of alcohol consumption carries risks, including increased cancer risk. Specifically for the brain, recent large studies like the UK Biobank suggest that even moderate consumption is associated with reduced gray matter volume and worse cognitive performance. There is no completely safe level of consumption for brain health. The message is not that an occasional drink will destroy your brain, but that the effects of alcohol are cumulative, dose-dependent, and never truly beneficial for the brain, only low risk when consumption is limited. We constantly lose neurons and can't do anything about it. This fatalistic belief holds that aging inevitably brings progressive neuronal loss that leads to unavoidable cognitive decline. This narrative, although partially based on real observations of brain changes with age, exaggerates the inevitability and underestimates the ability to influence the trajectory of brain aging through lifestyle choices. It is true that brain volume decreases with age, losing approximately 5% per decade after age 40, accelerating after age 70. The hippocampus, crucial for memory, loses approximately 1 to 2% of volume annually in older adults. However, this atrophy does not primarily reflect mass neuronal death as previously thought. The cerebral cortex shows relatively modest neuronal loss, typically less than 10%, even at very advanced age in cognitively healthy individuals. The most significant changes involve loss of synapses, reduction of dendritic volume, decreased myelination, and alterations in neurochemistry. Synaptic density in the prefrontal cortex can decrease up to 50% between youth and old age. This loss of connections rather than loss of neurons largely explains the cognitive changes associated with normal aging. Crucially, brain aging shows enormous individual variability. Some 70-year-olds show cognitive performance comparable to that of 30-year-olds, while others show substantial decline. This variability is not purely genetic, although genes influence it. Lifestyle choices explain a significant proportion of individual differences in brain aging trajectories. Regular aerobic exercise emerges as the most potent and consistently supported intervention for preserving brain structure and function. Multiple studies have shown that older adults who exercise regularly have greater hippocampal volume, better cerebral connectivity, and better performance on memory and executive function tests compared to sedentary counterparts. Exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which promotes neuronal survival, dendritic growth, and neurogenesis. Continuous cognitive stimulation is also protective. The concept of cognitive reserve suggests that continuous learning and intellectual engagement build redundant neural networks that provide a buffer against brain damage. People with higher education, cognitively demanding occupations, and intellectually stimulating hobbies show a lower risk of dementia, and when they develop Alzheimer's pathology, symptoms appear later and progress more slowly. Social engagement also impacts brain health. Social isolation is associated with an increased risk of cognitive decline and dementia, independent of other factors. Complex social interactions require multiple cognitive abilities, theory of mind, language processing, emotional regulation, that keep diverse brain networks active. The Mediterranean diet shows neuroprotective effects in observational studies and some intervention trials. Potentially beneficial components include omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants from fruits and vegetables, and anti-inflammatory compounds. However, the evidence for individual supplements, vitamin E, ginkgo biloba, etc., is weak. Benefits appear to come from complete dietary patterns, not isolated components. Control of cardiovascular risk factors, hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, in middle age is associated with lower risk of dementia decades later. The brain depends critically on adequate blood flow. Cumulative vascular damage substantially contributes to cognitive deterioration in aging. What is good for the heart is good for the brain. Even in people who develop neurodegenerative pathologies like Alzheimer's, lifestyle interventions can delay the onset of symptoms and slow progression. We are not completely helpless against brain aging. Although we cannot stop it entirely, we can significantly influence its trajectory through cumulative choices over decades. The brain is fully developed at 18 years old. The legal age of majority, 18 in many jurisdictions, creates the impression that brain development reaches completion upon attaining legal adulthood. This assumption influences policies on criminal responsibility, alcohol consumption, and military service. However, developmental neuroscience reveals that the brain continues to mature significantly until the mid-20s, with some regions not reaching full maturity until close to 30. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region involved in long-term planning, impulse control, risk assessment, and emotional regulation, is the last to mature. This region does not reach full structural development until approximately age 25. The myelination of connections between the prefrontal cortex and other brain regions continues until the late 20s, gradually improving processing speed and efficiency. Cortical gray matter, neuronal cell bodies, reaches its peak volume around early puberty, then gradually decreases during adolescence and early youth through a process of synaptic pruning. This process is not deterioration but refinement. Frequently used connections are strengthened while rarely used connections are eliminated, making neural networks more efficient and specialized. White matter, myelinated axons connecting brain regions, shows the opposite pattern. It continuously increases during adolescence and youth, improving integration and coordination between distant brain regions. The imbalance between emotional subcortical regions, which mature earlier, and prefrontal executive control regions, which mature later, partially explains why adolescents are prone to risk-taking and impulsive decisions. This developmental imbalance does not mean that adolescents are incapable of good judgment. They can clearly exhibit sophisticated reasoning in calm, non-social contexts. The problem primarily arises in emotionally charged situations, particularly with peer pressure, where hyperactivated subcortical emotional systems overwhelm the still developing prefrontal control systems. The legal implications are controversial. U.S. Supreme Court cases have cited developmental neuroscience as a reason to abolish the death penalty for juveniles and to limit life sentences without parole, arguing that brain immaturity reduces moral culpability. However, these considerations create tension with treating adolescents as adults in other legal contexts. Risk behaviors during adolescence, drug experimentation, reckless driving, unprotected sexual activity, have potentially serious consequences precisely because they occur when the brain is most vulnerable to lasting damage. Drug exposure during adolescence can alter brain development trajectories, increasing the risk of addiction and mental health problems in later years. The adolescent brain also exhibits positive characteristics that are often overlooked. Neuroplasticity is higher during adolescence than in any subsequent period except early childhood. This makes adolescence an optimal period for intensive learning, skill development, and identity exploration. The adolescent tendency toward novelty-seeking and moderate risk-taking may be evolutionarily adaptive, driving separation from the family of origin and exploration of new territories and opportunities. Brain development also does not definitively end at a specific age. Although the basic brain architecture stabilizes in the late 20s, plasticity continues throughout life. New experiences, learning, and environmental adaptation continue to reshape the brain, though generally on a smaller scale and speed than during developmental periods. The brain remains in a sense always developing, dynamically responding to the demands of our lives. Creative people are disorganized and chaotic. The stereotype of the creative genius living in disorganized chaos persists in popular culture. The artist with a messy studio, the scientist with an office piled high with papers, the writer whose desk is a disaster. Some psychological studies have even suggested that physical clutter can promote creative thinking by liberating from conventional norms. However, the reality of highly productive creative people often contradicts this stereotype. Studies of creativity and personality find that creative people show enormous diversity in personality traits, including order versus disorder. Some elite creators are meticulously organized. Others are chaotic. Creativity does not reliably predict organization in either direction. What does correlate with creativity is openness to experience, intellectual curiosity, aesthetic appreciation, active imagination, not disorganization. Studies that find correlations between environmental disorder and creativity typically examine short-term effects on specific creative tasks in a laboratory setting. For example, one study found that participants in a messy room generated more novel ideas in a brainstorming task than participants in an orderly room. But momentary creativity in 15-minute laboratory tasks is very different from sustained creativity that produces significant long-term creative work. Sustained creative productivity generally requires discipline, routines, and organizational systems, even if they are not visibly tidy. Productive writers typically maintain regular writing schedules. Creative scientists manage complex research projects that require careful planning, systematic documentation, and team coordination. Productive visual artists frequently maintain organized studios where they can locate materials efficiently. Author Mason Curry documented the daily routines of historical elite creators in Daily Rituals. A common pattern emerges. Almost all maintained structured and predictable routines that protected time for creative work. Although the content of the work was innovative, the process was often disciplined and regular. Creativity flourishes not in chaos but in the balance between structure, which provides stability and cognitive resources, and flexibility, which allows exploration. Productive clutter is real for some people. Stacking current project papers where they are visible and accessible makes functional sense. But this is different from the chaotic mess that results from genuine disorganization. The former is an unconventional but functional organizational system. The latter is an absence of system. People with productive clutter typically know where to find things in their apparent chaos. Those with genuine disorder constantly waste time searching. Research on cognitive load suggests that environmental clutter consumes attentional resources and increases stress because multiple stimuli compete for attention. Contrary to creative liberation, this generally reduces performance on tasks requiring sustained concentration and deep thinking. A cluttered workspace can be briefly stimulating but cognitively draining in the long term. Successful creative environments typically balance order and variety. Studies of innovative workspace architecture like Pixar or Google include tidy areas for focused work and more casual, varied areas for collaboration and casual encounters. The key is flexibility and options, not a single mandate for order or disorder. The stereotype also confuses consequence with cause. Some creative people may neglect organization because they are intensely focused on their creative work and consider organization a low-priority distraction. This does not mean that clutter causes or improves their creativity. It simply reflects their priorities and possibly personal tolerance for disorder. Other equally productive creators find that maintaining order reduces stress and frees up mental energy for creativity. The practical lesson is that you do not need to create artificial clutter to be more creative, nor do you need to sacrifice creativity to maintain organization. Find the organizational systems that work for your mind and work style. If clutter stresses and distracts you, organize without guilt. If unconventional systems work for you and you can locate things efficiently, continue regardless of external appearances. Crosswords and Sudoku prevent Alzheimer's. Mental puzzles like crosswords and Sudoku are widely marketed as a brain gym that can prevent or delay dementia. This promise is incredibly appealing. A simple, pleasurable solution to one of the most feared diseases of aging. Unfortunately, the evidence that these games prevent Alzheimer's is weak, although cognitively stimulating activities in general seem to offer some protection. Observational studies find that people who regularly engage in cognitively stimulating activities have a lower risk of developing dementia. However, these studies face a classic problem of reverse causality. Do the activities protect against dementia, or do people in the early stages of dementia simply abandon complex activities? Alzheimer's brain changes begin decades before symptoms appear, potentially affecting motivation and ability for intellectual activities. More rigorous intervention studies that randomly assign people to cognitive training versus control groups show that people improve on the specific tasks they practice, but these improvements generally do not transfer to other cognitive abilities or reduce the risk of dementia. Becoming proficient at Sudoku makes you better at Sudoku, but does not necessarily improve general memory, attention, or reasoning in other contexts. The active study trained older adults in memory, reasoning, or processing speed. Participants improved in the trained skills, and some benefits persisted years later, but there was no improvement in general cognitive functioning or daily living activities. Studies of commercial brain training applications show similar results. Improvements on specific training tasks without broad generalization. The reason for this specificity is that the brain does not work like a general muscle that strengthens uniformly with exercise. Neural networks are highly specialized. Training a specific skill strengthens the networks relevant to that skill, but does not necessarily improve networks used for different tasks. Solving crosswords improves vocabulary and word retrieval, but does not necessarily improve spatial reasoning, processing speed, or memory for recent events. The concept of cognitive reserve offers a more nuanced perspective. Cognitive reserve refers to the brain's resilience to pathological damage, built through a lifetime of education, cognitively demanding occupation, and diverse intellectual engagement. Autopsies reveal that some people had extensive Alzheimer's pathology, amyloid plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, but never showed clinical symptoms of dementia during life. These individuals typically had high cognitive reserve built through decades of varied intellectual stimulation. The key seems to be variety and novelty, not repetition of the same tasks. Repeatedly solving the same type of puzzle eventually becomes automated, requiring less cognitive effort. The brain benefits more from learning completely new skills that challenge unfamiliar abilities. Learning a new language, a musical instrument, or a complex physical skill likely offers more cognitive benefit than becoming an expert at crosswords. Socially engaging, cognitively stimulating activities can be particularly beneficial. Playing complex board games with friends, participating in book club discussions, or teaching skills to others combines cognitive stimulation with social engagement, both protective against cognitive decline. Crucially, no cognitive intervention can prevent Alzheimer's in people genetically predisposed to early-onset forms, nor can it reverse the disease once established. The protective effects of cognitive stimulation are modest and probabilistic, delaying symptoms by years in some cases but not offering immunity. Claims that specific apps or products can prevent dementia are exaggerations not supported by evidence. The practical conclusion is that crosswords and Sudoku are enjoyable and mentally stimulating activities that are worthwhile in themselves, but they are not vaccines against dementia. To optimize long-term brain health, focus on a holistic lifestyle. Regular aerobic exercise, a healthy diet, control of cardiovascular risk factors, rich social connections, and continuous learning of new and diverse skills throughout life. Repressed memories can be recovered in therapy. The idea that severe traumas can be completely forgotten, repressed, and then recovered decades later through specific therapeutic techniques has been profoundly controversial in psychology and has led to devastating legal consequences. The notion was popularized in the 1980s and 90s but is now largely rejected by memory neuroscientists and evidence-based clinical psychologists. The concept of repression comes from Freudian psychoanalytic theory. The mind supposedly protects the individual from intolerable traumatic memories by pushing them into the unconscious where they remain inaccessible to consciousness but continue to influence behavior. Although theoretically appealing, the empirical evidence for this mechanism is notably weak. Studies of documented trauma survivors, concentration camps, combat, abuse, find that the problem is typically not an inability to remember but an inability to forget. Traumatic memories tend to be vivid, intrusive, and persistent, characteristic of post-traumatic stress disorder. The amygdala, intensely activated during traumatic events, strengthens memory consolidation, making traumatic memories particularly resistant to forgetting. Amnesia for traumatic events, when it occurs, generally results from situational factors, intoxication, brain injury, peritraumatic dissociation, not from active repression. In the 1980s and 90s, some therapists used suggestive techniques, hypnosis, guided imagery, dream interpretation, explicitly designed to recover supposed repressed memories of childhood abuse. This practice led to thousands of accusations of abuse based on recovered memories, fracturing families and leading to incarcerations. Subsequently, many of these memories were retracted when accusers recognized that the memories were false, inadvertently implanted during suggestive therapy. Research by Elizabeth Loftus and colleagues experimentally demonstrated that it is possible to implant completely false memories of events that never occurred using suggestive techniques. In the Lost in the Mall paradigm, participants were convinced through suggestions from relatives and therapists that they had been lost in a shopping mall during childhood, an event that never occurred. Participants developed detailed memories, complete with sensory details and emotions, of these fictitious events. The mechanisms are similar to those that create false memories in non-therapeutic contexts: repeated suggestion, guided imagery that generates mental content mistaken for genuine memory, social pressure to conform to expectations, and the normal reconstructive process of memory that incorporates post-event information into past narratives. Therapists who strongly believe in repressed memories can transmit these expectations, and vulnerable and suggestible clients may unconsciously generate memories that satisfy these expectations. This does not mean that every delayed report of abuse is false. Many genuine abuse victims do not disclose their experiences for years or decades due to shame, fear, dependence on the abuser, or normalization of the abuse. These individuals typically always remembered the abuse but chose not to disclose it, very different from completely forgetting it and then recovering it. The distinction between silence about continuous memories versus complete amnesia followed by recovery is crucial. Professional psychological organizations have issued warnings against memory recovery techniques. The American Psychological Association recognizes that while amnesia for traumatic events can occur in limited circumstances, there is no reliable way to distinguish genuine from false memories based solely on phenomenological characteristics, vividness, emotional detail. False memories can feel completely genuine. The harm caused by the recovered memory controversy is bidirectional. Innocent people were falsely accused and imprisoned based on testimony of recovered memories that were later proven false. Simultaneously, the resulting skepticism created an environment where genuine abuse victims who report their experiences late face unfair discredit. The solution is neither to assume all delayed reports are false nor that all are true, but to evaluate evidence case by case without relying on the existence of repression as a mechanism. The broader lesson is that human memory does not work like a video recording that can be faithfully replayed if you find the correct file. Memory is reconstructive, malleable, and susceptible to influence by expectations, suggestions, and social context. Ethical therapists avoid suggestive techniques and recognize the limitations of memory as evidence of past events.